The New Norm is brought to you by Winning at Home. I'm Steve Norman. Welcome to The New Norm. When I was in grad school, I had a professor by the name of Sherwood Lingenfelter, and he led a devotion for class once on a pretty significant mistake that Moses made. And I call this one the staff and the stick. Let's look at Numbers chapter 20 together. This is verses 1 through 13. In the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin, and they stayed at Kadesh. There, Miriam died and was buried. Now, there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness, that we and our livestock should die here? Why'd you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs or grapevines or pomegranates, and there's no water to drink." Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meeting and fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord said to Moses, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. And you will bring water out of the rock for the community so that they and their livestock can drink." So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he'd commanded him. And he and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock. And Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff, and water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." These were the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord and where he was proved holy among them. Now, according to the text, the mistake that Moses makes here is so significant that it disqualifies him from his primary mission, which was to lead the people into the promised land. This mistake, this meltdown at Meribah, ends up barring Moses and Aaron from entering the promised land, the one thing that they were there to do. Now, let's talk for a second about the staff, because there are a couple of key characters throughout the Exodus journey, the Israelites wandering through the wilderness for 40 years. Moses is a key character. Aaron is a key character. Miriam is a key figure. But the staff itself gets referred to multiple times. So the staff, even though it's an inanimate object, is its own character that has a through line in the books of Exodus and Numbers. In fact, the staff makes its first appearance in Exodus chapter 4, when God appears to Moses in the burning bush, and Moses is struggling with this call. He's overwhelmed by it, and he says this in Exodus 4:1, "God, what if they don't believe me or listen to me and say the Lord did not appear to you?" And then the Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" "A staff," he replied. The Lord said, "Throw it on the ground." Moses threw it on the ground and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail." So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. "This," said the Lord, "is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." So this stick, this staff that Moses had been using to shepherd actual sheep, is reclaimed, reframed, and transformed by the Lord at his moment of calling. It becomes a symbol of his role as shepherd of the people of Israel, his influence, his ability to lead them out of captivity into freedom, and his authority, his ability to speak on God's behalf to his people. The staff is so significant that we read in Exodus 4:20, "So Moses took his wife and his sons and put them on a donkey and started back to Egypt. And he took the staff of God in his hand." The staff gets a new name. It goes from just being kind of Moses' stick to the staff of God. It makes another appearance later in the story in Exodus chapter 9, when the seventh plague hits the people of Egypt. This is the plague of hail. We read this in Exodus 9, verse 22. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand towards the sky so that hail will fall over Egypt, on people and animals and on everything growing in the fields of Egypt. And when Moses stretched out his staff, the staff of God, toward the sky, the Lord sent thunder and hail, and lightning flashed down to the ground. So the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. Hail fell and lightning flashed back and forth. It was the worst storm in all the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. So again, here's another moment where the staff makes a key appearance. Moses raises it so that nobody is confused that this is not a random storm. It is coming at Moses' invitation by the very hand of God. This happens again in the next chapter when the 8th plague, the plague of locusts, hits Egypt. In Exodus 10, verses 13, it says, Moses stretched out his staff over Egypt, and the Lord made an east wind blow across the land all that day and all that night. By morning, the wind had brought locusts. They invaded all Egypt and settled down in every area of the country in great numbers. Never before had there been such a plague of locusts, nor will there ever be again. So here's the staff, making another appearance, inviting the wrath of God and a rebuke against the Egyptians who are rejecting his invitation to trust him and let the people go. Maybe the most famous moment is when, after the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, Moses leads the people to the edge of the sea. In Exodus 14, God says, raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I'll harden the hearts of the Egyptians so they will go in after them, and I will gain glory. There's that phrase again. I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. So staff doesn't just reveal that God is with Moses. It is evidence to God's people and their enemies that God is moving on behalf of the Israelites at Moses' request. We read later, once the people have crossed the Red Sea and are in the wilderness, in Acts 17 about a key battle that they're having against a tribe of people called the Amalekites, who came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. And Moses said to Joshua, choose some of our men and go out and fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands. So Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. And as long as Moses held up his hands, ostensibly with the staff in it, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. And when Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur held his hands up, one on one side and one on the other, so his hands, again with the staff in them, remained steady until sunset. So Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. So the staff of God. Evidence that Moses has been chosen. The staff of God. Evidence that God is with him and is acting on his behalf, whether it's in kind of political combat against the Egyptians or actual combat against the Amalekites. The staff, it's a symbol of God's presence, a symbol of God's favor, a symbol of God's anointing, a symbol of Moses' spiritual influence. So with that in mind, let's look at what happens in Numbers chapter 20 again. So Moses took the staff of God, from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him. And he and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, listen, you rebels. Must we bring you water out of this rock? Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. So at first reading, you could say, I don't understand what the big deal is. Moses uses the staff. The people are thirsty. The people get water. Everybody wins. But there's three unique problems in this little incident. First, Moses lashes out at the people in anger. And for most of the story, whenever God is really angry, he goes, hey, Moses, step aside from the Israelites. I'm going to wipe them all out. And Moses always advocates for the people. And he's like, Lord, they're reckless and they're irresponsible. don't destroy them. It'll be bad for, it'll be the end of their story, but it'll also be the end of your glory, because all of their enemies, the neighboring nations, will say like, hey, God led the people of Israel out of slavery only to destroy them. So Moses always does a good job of advocating for God's honor and for the people's well-being. But in this particular episode, Moses' desire to shepherd the people goes sideways. Instead of advocating for them, instead of viewing them as reckless and misguided lost sheep, he goes, listen, you rebels. I might need to take another look at the entire arc of the way that Moses interacts with the people, but I think this is the only instance where he lashes out at them in anger in this way. So Moses, rather than shepherding the people, it takes an antagonistic tone and posture towards them. So that's the first problem. The second problem is he says, must we bring you water out of this rock? It's very interesting because although God says, I'm asking you to bring water out of the rock, the implication, of course, is always that God is bringing water out of the rock. If Moses and Aaron could bring water out of the rock on their own, there wouldn't have been any need to intercede for God's help in this matter. So Moses and Aaron kind of get a little chippy. They get angry with the people, and then they forget that it's God who's doing the providing, not them. And unfortunately, I've seen some leaders, spiritual leaders, people who are wired and called to be shepherds, get a little sideways. And just like Moses and Aaron did here, they get combative with their people rather than leading them with a gentle rebuke. They get hostile towards the people. They come down at them in an authoritarian and a didactic manner, and then they say, "Hey, we're the godlike figure in this story. We're the shepherd. We're the redeemer. We're the provider. We're the miracle maker." When in fact, none of that is true. So the first problem is, listen, you rebels. The second problem is, must we bring you water out of the rock? And then the third problem isn't something that they say, it's something that they do. It says, then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock. He's supposed to speak to the rock, but because he's so enraged, he strikes the rock. And here's what I find particularly horrifying, at least for Moses, is this, that he struck the rock twice. Think about that for a moment. Moses struck the rock with the staff of God, and nothing happens. Now, imagine the sheer terror that had to have overwhelmed Moses in that moment, because up until this point in the story, every single time he has wielded the staff in front of the people on God's behalf, he's always gotten the promised and intended result. When he threw down the staff in front of Pharaoh's people, or when Aaron threw down his staff in front of Aaron's people, it immediately turned into a snake. Like they didn't have to try multiple times. When he lifted the staff for the locusts to come, they came. When he lifted the staff for the hail to come, they came. When he lifted the staff to stop the Amalekites, and as long as he kept it up in the air, the tide of battle went the way that it was supposed to. Moses has never needed the staff in multiple tries to do anything before. So in this instance where he strikes the rock with the staff of God and nothing happens, what's the implication? It's that God isn't listening. That God's favor, at least in that moment, has lifted. That Moses, rather than acting out of love for the people and honor for God, is acting out of anger, is acting out of rage, is seeking to lead the people through shame rather than love, and he doesn't get the result that he wants. And so he strikes the rock again. And because God is merciful and kind, he allows it to bring forth water. But I'll never forget my professor, Sherwood Lingenfelter, saying that in that moment, the staff, which was a representation of God's favor, became a stick. It became a club. Rather than a shepherd's crook that Moses was using to lead the people, it became a weapon that he used to bludgeon them. And I want to remind you that no matter who you are or where you are in this season of your life, God has given you a staff. something to represent his favor, something that represents his hand on your life, something that is an extension of your gifts, your talents, your abilities, your spiritual wiring that God can and will and does use so that you can exercise influence either in your home or in your church or in your neighborhood or in your business. And God has given you that as a gift for you to steward for his purposes and not yours. And if we're not careful, in moments of weakness or moments of temptation or moments of rage or moments of insecurity, the staff of God turns into a stick that we use for us rather than a tool that we use for him. So I want to ask you this question. Where are you tempted to strike the rock in anger rather than speak to it out of obedience? Where are you tempted to weaponize your influence for your own gain rather than offer it up in service to God and his people? Because the consequences for Moses were pretty severe. And I think that the consequences for us when we take the staff of God and turn it into a weapon that we use for our own pride, greed, or glory, not only strips God of the honor that he deserves in that moment, but it also wounds, hurts, and demeans the people that God has called us to love and honor in that moment. My guess is you probably don't have to think too hard about a leader who allowed their staff to become a stick. Maybe because they weren't walking in obedience, maybe because they got drunk on power, maybe because they weren't doing their own internal work. So what does it look like for you to kind of safeguard your influence these days and make sure that the tools that God has put at your disposal to serve others don't turn into weapons that you use to bulldoze them or beat them down so that you can get what you want? Something to think about today. The New Norm is produced and distributed by Winning at Home. Winning at Home is a faith-based nonprofit committed to making individuals, couples, families, and businesses stronger through counseling and coaching. For more information, visit winningathome.com. I'm your host, Steve Norman. Thanks for listening.